Hi, Michael James. It's November 1st, 2013. This is a discussion about the new workflow. It's a discussion about Enblend, Enfuse, kind of the same thing, bracketing, camera gear, all rolled into one. This is to supplement what is all the other tutorials, which is really based on the software. So let me, before I talk about bracketing, just discuss Enfuse and Enblend. And it's related, because if you understand what Enblend and Enfuse are doing in the background, then you can understand why you bracket the way you bracket. So let me start out with just saying that if you look for the white paper on Enblend, you'll find a few key features in there. You got to dig around for them. But for me, the aha moments were when it discussed photon noise. So every camera has just a little bit of photon noise that occurs generally in the shadows. And that's typical. It doesn't mean that it's like the exact same print on every photo, which is key, because the way Enblend works is, and Enfuse, is as you go through LightRoom and you grab a bunch of shots and you give it to it, it's going to look at each individual shot. It's going to fix the noise from the previous frames and the frames that are further down the pipeline. It's going to use the other frames to fix the photon noise. Now, that's a great feature. Secondly, and the biggest takeaway or the second biggest takeaway was, it also sharpens per pixel based on you feeding it more frames. So, for example, if you were to take 18 shots spaced at 1/3 of a step in between and bracketed from fast shutter speed to slow shutter speed, if you did that and then you turned around and you actually just did a six frame bracket, but you had a full EV step in between, you're going to cover the same dynamic range. The difference is when you send the 18 shots into Enfuse, it's going to fix the shadows as it adds more frames to the mix. So those 18 shots, it's going to look through there and it's going to fix a lot of the noise issues for you. It happens automatically. It's a part of the research that was done, etc. The other thing it does is it sharpens per pixel. So if you then go to the 6 shots that you took with a full EV step in between, and you do the same blend, if you zoom in 100 or 200% and you look back and forth between the two images, depending on how difficult the scene was or how many shadows there were, you'll notice that you get better shadow data when you gave it more frames. You also get a slightly sharper image, the one that you gave it more frames, because of the way that Enfuse and Enblend sharpens per pixel. So understanding that is key, because then you know and understand that when you bracket, you don't want to do things like I've had people say, well, I'm just doing 2 EV steps just to get in and out as fast as possible. Well, then I get emails saying I'm not getting the same results as you. And you know, this is a part of it, is that you have to understand the technology behind the open source software Enblend, which is Enfuse. The plugin is Enfuse. So that said, it's also important to understand that just creating virtual copies in LightRoom doesn't solve the problem. So if you took those 6 shots and just took virtual copies, it's the same shot. So just moving the EV around isn't going to help you out. It's not going to sharpen per pixel per se, because it's the same exact shot. It's not the same as giving it 18 individual shots. And I'm not saying 18 shots spaced 1/3 of a space between is the way you should bracket. I'm just giving you an example to say that you understand the technology. That way, if you go out and you're going to bracket, you'd be thinking to yourself, you know, maybe I should do 2/3 of a stop instead of this full EV stop or 1.3 EV stops in between, because now, as Mike says, you're going to get a little bit of a sharper image and you're going to get better noise data. So all that said, let me discuss what I consider to be the new workflow. The new workflow really is based upon, as everything in my workflow is based upon, was a problem. I had my D3 shutter die in December of 2012. Okay, I had to ship it off, and they had to get stuff from Japan. It was going to take weeks, so I had to default to using the Nikon 14-24 on an older 5D Classic, which is very noisy in the shadows. And I didn't realize how problematic it was and how much of an issue it was until I really went out there and started bracketing some shots, and I found that the old way of doing things, of adjusting aggressively in the shadows on the really fast shutter speeds all the way up through the entire range, and then trying to pull it all together by using all those frames as a base point, it wasn't working with the 5D. And I thought, you know, I've got to find a different way to get through this, because I got to deliver quality images to the clients. So I decided that I was going to attack this from 2 standpoints. I was going to start from just below a well-exposed frame, so I'd start a little bit on the dark side, and then I'd work my way up through the overexposed frames. So that would sometimes be roughly 7 to 9 frames, spaced to 2/3 of a step in between. So I would adjust those where I was lifting shadows on the faster shutter speeds, and then when I got to the really overexposed frames where the highlights were completely blown out, because I was doing 2/3 of a step in between, I was dragging down the EV, by about 0.35, and then the next image up on the more exposed frame, I'd bring it down 0.7. So basically, as you do the math, it's like I was bringing it down 1/3 of a stop incrementally. And by doing that, I was pulling the exposure down so that the shadows, which were so well exposed, were getting more appropriately squished together with the other ones, so that when I blend them together, I get a fairly natural tone curve, but really clean shadows. Blown out highlights, but really clean shadows. So that becomes what I consider to be the base. And then what I would do is I would take the really fast shutter speed shots, still aggressively going up on the shadows and dialing back on the actual contrast, and I would then paint in, using those as the top layers, I would paint in better highlights over top of what I consider the base, which was from just below the mid-range shot to the overexposed frames. So that's been the dramatic shift, and it was all because I was using this 5D. Well, of course, I had to kind of explore, and I went and I grabbed my dad's T2i, and I did the same thing. I bracketed, and I wanted to see if I got better results, and I did. And I thought, because APS-C sensors generally, compared to their full frame sensor cousins, are a little bit noisier in the shadows, I was like, well, this is going to work for everything. And then when I got my D3 back, I thought, well, cool, now I can just go back to the way I used to do things. But because I had been doing this now for weeks and weeks, I was finding that the image quality was so much better in the shadows, which, for MLS or VRBO or just small web stuff, it disappears when you reduce it down anyway. The shadows really kind of get crunched away. But I have some clients that print stuff up, do not necessarily billboards, but magazines spreads. So the shadows were all of a sudden becoming, so much cleaner by doing this even with the D3. I was like, well, I need to do a new tutorial series showing this new workflow because it's what I'm doing now, and hence the new tutorials. But because it's different, that's where the whole thing of where the windows would, or highlights, because it could be windows that's the brightest point, or it could be light bulbs inside that's the brightest point, but that's where that became the top layer, and then I would have to paint those in. And because of the way that I changed the workflow, there were times where I would have to, then after painting it in, it still wasn't quite great contrast. You'd have to create that other layer with just the window data, bring the capacity down 15–20%, change it to overlay, and then hit it with a highlight shadow sometimes also, to bring the contrast back in the windows. And then there was other times where I actually had to do 2 passes on the highlights, where I did like all the highlights as one, maybe about 7 or 8 frames, but then I only did like the fastest shutter speeds for maybe 3 or 4 frames, and that would even be another higher level in the actual hierarchy, as I've shown. I show this in the tutorials. And then that I would have to even get rid of the really, really high highlights that still are kind of blown out. And then again, copy the layer, overlay, bring the opacity down, hit it with a highlight shadow to bring the contrast back. Then once I was happy with the entire frame, then I would do, and I would flatten that, and I would create, the new layer, take it to 15%, overlay blend mode, hit it with a highlight shadow, and then adjust around, making sure mid-tone contrast on the bottom's at 60, the very, very top you're at 100, and then 50, and then the middle range I would actually even mess around with changing the highlights. So I would see if bringing back highlights was going to be okay, but you have to be careful with sharp edges with roofs, that sometimes it will create almost that HDR-y kind of look where it's pulling in too much, because shadow highlights is in fact a tone mapping algorithm of sorts. So that was what I really kind of changed everything, and I had to go back and redo the tutorials. Some of you are new, some of you have never seen those old tutorials. Those of you that did it the old way, this I found to be the most effective. So bracketing, if you want to get really specific, because I get people say, how should I bracket? For me, bracketing is very simple, because whether you're using a promote control or you're going to use the camera features and you're going to move the dial around. The whole point of it is, for me, the easiest thing to do is to start out by just a single shot. Before I even do anything, is like, let's figure out where the highlights are. So I'll take a single shot, and you'll get used to this after time, like shooting with like light coming through the windows, or shooting with really bright exposed bulbs. You're like, okay, I'm at f8, D3's it's an ISO 200 based camera, so I'm there, and I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to be somewhere around 1/320th of a second. So I'll take a shot and I'll look at the LCD and I'll look at the histogram, and as long as I'm nowhere near blowing out, and the brightest thing is probably right in the middle of the histogram, well, I know that I can take 1 or 2 shots easily from there and keep moving up to slower shutter speeds, and I'll have at least 3 or 4 really good shots that have varying exposure on the highlights. So people are like, well, do you take 3 shots, 9 shots, or 12 shots, or 13 shots? And the bottom line is, it depends on every single room. A lot of times what I'll do is, just for simplicity's sake, is that I know going at 2/3 of a stop in between and shooting say 14 or 15 shots, you're gonna get everything you need. If you started at the really fast shutter speeds and you had protected highlights at that point, worst case scenario, you're like, well, you had 3 really blown out overexposed frames at the end. Well, just delete them. I mean, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, for me, I come back from a shoot and my whole point is to get in and get out, get everything bracketed, make sure you got enough content. If I have time in between, the actual room to room, I might delete the ones that were really overexposed. But I don't spend a tremendous amount of time anymore trying to figure out, okay, what's the brightest point? What's the darkest shadow? Now let me calculate what that is all in between. For me, it's just easier to say, overshoot it, do 2/3 of a step in between, start at the fastest shutter speed, go up to about 15 shots, and by the way, 15 shots is what the new beta is on the Magic Lantern software. So the Magic Lantern firmware for like the 5D and all the different Canon ones that it's available for right now, they just increased from 9 to 15. So now you can do 15 shots with Magic Lantern. They clearly are listening, because this was an issue where 9 wasn't really quite enough for a guy doing architecture. You don't want to do full one-step EVs, and even then sometimes it doesn't capture everything. Well, 15 is beautiful because you can do 2/3 of a step in between, start with the really fast shutter speeds and protects the highlights, and then ramp straight up through. You don't have to touch the camera. With Magic Lantern, I think the best practice is just to do it as like a 2-second delay. So even if you don't have a shutter, remote shutter, you can just press it and you have 2 seconds for the camera to settle, and we'll go through and do all 15 shots for you. If you're using a Promote Control, clearly you can just do it with the Promote Control. And on that note, one of the reasons why I do like to Promote Control is because, as you know, I do take the extra flash frames. So one thing that I like about the Promote Control is that you can set it to do the bracket of 15, immediately change the mode to single shot, turn on the flash, and then you can adjust the shutter speed right here, and you never have to touch the camera. So you're never going to have an issue of you're moving the camera around. And to take it even a step further, I used to always keep the flash, the speed light, sitting on top of the camera itself. But what I've really migrated towards is, and I'm kind of liking this workflow, is this, and I'll have to post what this is. It was pretty cheap. It's a Velo, it's a dual TTL cord, off-camera flash cord. Works for both Canon and Nikon. And I have both systems, so that's great for me. It's 33 feet long. I'm not going to unravel this thing. So this part goes on top of the actual camera itself, and then this lays all the way to the ground. And then when I'm ready to take the extra shots, like I said, I mean, I just bracketed with the Promote Control. I just turn it to the single shot mode, and then I turn the flash on, which isn't on the camera anymore. It's sitting on the ground. And then that way, I can aim the flash fairly close to the lens and do those flash shots, changing the shutter speed with the Promote Control. Never have to touch the camera. So I don't even run the risk of like trying to turn on the flash while it's sitting on top of, on top of the actual DSLR, and then, oh shoot, I accidentally moved a little bit, and now you got to deal with alignment issues in post. So this is a great little addition that I've really liked. The other reason I like this is that I've been able to walk out into a room. So let's just say there's a window way on the other side of the room. Well, this is 33 feet. So I can actually just, you have to touch the camera for this part. But for me, I can just walk out, turn the camera onto like 10-second mode on timer, and then I can hit it and then walk out to on the other side of the room and hit windows that I wouldn't be able to get from on the other side of the room, just because they're too far away. And you know how flash works, it just loses its power as it gets further and further away from the actual lens and the actual flash unit itself. So that brings up another point which people ask about, well, what about the flash shots? What are you doing with those? There's two things with the flash shots that are really important. One is to stripe the windows, directly at the windows, with really high shutter speeds. So all of these cameras and systems allow high sync so that you can go above 1/200th in some cases of cameras can't go past that to sync, or 1/250th with other pro bodies. So you can go up to 1/320th, 1/500th. So would you want to do that? Because if you're trying to get really, really bright highlights that are outside, but you want to get those window frames, which would normally be extremely dark, painted a little bit with light, that's what this is for. That's what you're going to hit those frames with at a high shutter speed. I'm usually at f8, start at about 1/250th to see, depending on the room, depending on how bright it is outside, depending on where the sun is set. I may have to go up higher on sync mode to 1/320th, 1/400th. And the nice thing is once you set it either on the flash or in the camera, it depends if you're a Canon or Nikon, you can just leave it forever. It'll just always sync if you go to those really fast shutter speeds. So that's one of the things that I use those flash frames for, is to get really good window data that's also painting those frames that would normally be really dark. That way when you blend those together with the really fast shutter speeds that have good window data but really dark, noisy frames, when you blend them together with Enfuse, it really gives you a nice result. So the other reason you use the flash is to fire up into the ceiling or off of walls on the side, left and right, in order to bounce light that kind of acts like an overall diffuser. So it's almost like somebody walked out and just put a nice softbox real high up and is just kind of filling in all of the shadows below. Now, granted, it's going to create, ceiling fan shadows, and it's going to create, some really strange, blowing out of ceilings. But that's not the issue, because you're not going to use that data up there. You're only going to be painting in masking in the bottom section. So whether you just fuse out all of the flash frames where you vary the shutter speed up and down and you vary the flash power up and down just to get a little variation in the room. So you could do that as a fuse, as you've seen in the tutorials, and then you can also blend some of the flash frames together with the actual bracket so that it just is a little subtle addition of light, so it doesn't look like it was overwhelmed with flash. And again, the masking out of the ceiling itself with just the luminosity shots with no flash off is the way to get rid of the shadows and whatnot that's there, and that's covered in the tutorials, and I'm probably going to do more tutorials on that, just showing it over and over again in various scenarios. That seems to be a sticking point for some people on that one there. But people are like, well, how many flash shots? And the answer is it really depends on the room. I mean, because if the room is long and thin, you might have to send some shots right up into the ceiling, and then you might actually have to angle it down a little bit so it bounces off the further part of the ceiling and then gets a little bit deeper into the room. With this cord, you could actually then walk out into frame and go up into the ceiling in those areas that are too far away. And you could do things with this you can take it even further. You can hit pillows on beds. You can hit accent pieces, art on the wall. And then that way you can mask in just nice highlights for those particular areas. I haven't done a tutorial on that yet, but I will. So more than anything else, I wanted to talk about everything I've talked about so far, and then I want to talk about software that's coming down the road. So the software that's coming down the road, I'm under NDA, I can't talk about specifics. All I can say is that what I see coming is going to be a really nice change. It's not going to change the workflow in the perspective that I'll never use LightRoom and never use Enfuse, because I'm still going to use those. The difference is that this software is going to be able to do things that no other piece of software can do right now, and then you'll be able to export out a couple of versions, bring that in, and then blend the brackets together with that to get really great results. And from what I've seen, you can actually just use that software to get amazing results all on its own. I mean, it's going to cut down post-production by more than half. I mean, I'm excited about it, because the one thing that you'll never be able to fix, even though that's going to be available, the one thing you can never fix is the fact that you're going to have the mix of tungsten and daylight, and you still have to fix that. That's where those extra flash frames make such a difference, because you're overwhelming the tungsten. And you know, even if with those flash frames is not enough power in the room to overwhelm the tungsten, you look in the back of the LCD and you can clearly look and see when the flash goes off, it washes out the tungsten depending on your shutter speed. But if that still doesn't work, or if there's tungsten way across the room that the flash can't quite reach, then that's the circumstance where you need to turn off all the lights in the room, all the tungsten, and then just fire off the flash all by itself, because now the only color that's touching the room is the flash Kelvin, which is roughly 5400 Kelvin. So, and that's the other thing, is I used to go out into the room with a digital target, and I used to do this convoluted thing where I'd do a custom white balance, and then I'd shoot with that custom white balance. And you know, in the end, what I found was I just was like, you know what, I'm just shooting auto. As long as there's something in the room that's white or silver that I can kind of spot check. More importantly for the flash frames, because I'm fixing the color issues with the flash frames, as you see in the video, more so than worrying about exactly what the color temperature was in the non-flash frames, which I kind of call the luma frames, the luminosity frames. So I'm kind of jumping back and forth in between right here, because you know, there is a lot of content to this, and there is a lot that, you know, to consume as you start to go down this path. For me, it's been one little piece at a time, so when I actually have to sit down and explain everything, I'm like scratching my head. I'm like, you know, I can't believe how much of this stuff that these were all problems that I had that I just, you know, sat down one day and found a solution to and fixed it. And it seems to me so basic, because I can go into a condo, shoot the whole thing in like an hour, just fire off the bracket frames, turn the flash on, fire them up in the air, fire them with high shutter speeds at the windows, and off to the next room, because you've got everything you need. Even if you overexpose too many times by over bracketing, it doesn't matter. You got all the frames you're going to need to use in post. As long as, and to me, the most important thing is to get those flash frames fired off, because that's how you fix color. And the fire off flash frames at the really, really bright light sources, because that's how you're going to fix, you know, the globes that are on a vanity, or the windows that are, you know, blazing sun coming through and there's a lake or a ocean or a pool outside, so that you can fix that. And more importantly, so that the frames get hit with a little bit of light, so that when you blend them with the frames that were fast shutter speeds that have really dark, noisy frames, it blends them together, so that way when you're painting in, you get a much higher quality highlights and window. So with the Promote Control, I wish this was in camera, and Magic Lantern actually has really got me paying attention, because I'm seriously considering making my next full frame camera Canon, now that they've done that hack. Because to get 15 shots off, not have to touch the camera for that set, I mean, that's pretty huge. And all the guys out there that have been shooting Canon, that I've kind of been like, well look, if you're Canon, you really need to have Promote Control. And now, you know, it makes it where Nikon, where I have really important shoots where I won't chance touching the camera and using the in-camera AEB, I use this, but it's just having this extra piece of kit and having it dangle, and it's just a pain in the butt. I mean, plus, not to mention the fact it's like $330, so if you haven't invested in it yet, that's another thing that you have to invest in. Let me just take a pause here for a second and see if I'm missing anything else that I really need to cover. Well, I just thought about it for a moment. Probably best to just post this and then wait for people to ask specific questions, and then I'll do another video tutorial to talk a little bit more about whatever gaps there are there. One of the things just to talk about, the dynamic range of sensors. So huge. Because like a T2i per se, and I don't mean to pick on any particular one, but Canon just has a lower dynamic range. So you have to realize if you're shooting with that kind of a camera, you're getting roughly, I think it's like 10 point something EV steps of full range. Now, that doesn't mean you've got really clean data for 10 steps. It's just a fact that that's the measurement. DxOMark.com, under the landscape for sensors, gives you what each camera sensor really can do. Versus some of the Nikon cameras, even the APS-C, that are ranked all the way up like to 13, all the way up near 14. And I personally can tell you that shooting with a 5D Mark II, and I also have shot now with the D600, which has a very high dynamic range setting of around 14, it is unbelievable when you move that EV exposure slider back and forth, how much range you have in that 14 EV. It is absolutely critical that if you're going to do this, you know, long term, to consider you know, not just certain little features, but my gosh, look at the dynamic range of the sensors, because it's going to absolutely change the way that you have to shoot. If you choose an APS-C sensor that's, you know, a Canon, you might even want to go up to 1/3 of a step in between versus 2/3 of a step in between if you've got a sensor that's ranked 12, 13, or 14 by DxOMark.com. It really is such a big difference. It's not just that it has a lot of range when you move the EV slider, it's the quality of the shadows when you amp up that, and if you amp up the shadow slider, it's the quality that you get in the shadows from that sensor that is just mind-blowing. I mean, it really is. I've seen tests online where they have a 5D Mark III versus a D600 using the exact same lens, and you know, the guy in LightRoom yanks back and forth to show you how much more range there is with the D600 versus the 5D Mark III. I'm sorry, I think I said 2. It's just remarkable. That said, Magic Lantern's got some interesting things where they're doing a dual shot with 2 ISOs, and it's like giving you more dynamic range in one shot. I haven't tested that out yet, but I think that would be problematic to try and do for an entire bracket. Maybe it isn't, maybe it is, but what I like to see is just the fact that we are going down the road of more dynamic range instead of just the pixel attack that we've had for all these years, where everyone's trying to get as many pixels as possible into a sensor. Because in the end, I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have sensors that can do almost the entire shot in one shot. Now, I personally think from a quality standpoint, we're probably going to get to a point where you'd probably maybe bracket 3 or 4, where if it was 20 plus stops, that's going to be all you need. What would be interesting to see is that if using Enfuse or you know, not having as many frames to not get as sharp as results like I do now, if that becomes a factor. Won't know, but you know, as my workflow changes, I'll make updates to the training itself. So I think at this point right now, I'll leave it open to any questions anyone has. So whatever I didn't cover in this video that you were hoping to get answers for, just email me, digitalcoastimage@gmail.com, or you know, post elsewhere that, you know, we're in touch, and then that way I can appropriately decide what the format, whether it be a text or a video tutorial or another one of these where I just discuss it openly. But that's it, over and out for now, and I'll just leave it at that.